Thanks, Denise. My name's Jordan. If I haven't met you before, I'm a part of the team here. It's great to bring God's word to us this morning. I want to start by asking you a question. Is there a time that you can remember feeling anxious about something? I have a very clear one in my mind. I did primary teaching at uni. I'm a primary teacher by trade, and that is enough probably for a lot of people to feel anxious just thinking about doing that. But I remember there was one time in uni where what they would get you to do is instead of teaching you how to do a lesson, they would just get you to do some lessons as if you were a child. And then that started off all right. It was a little bit of a bludge for a couple of weeks. I drew some dogs. I cut out some magazine pictures. It was great. And then it came to drama. And my heart sunk. We had to do a drama in front of our peers. And I remember hearing about this coming next week and being like, I think I'm going to drop out. I'm 3.5 years into this thing, but I think this is the last straw. I remember calling my wife and being like, I need to find a way out of this. Is there any way I can wriggle around? And eventually I found my way out of it. It was good. It was a good time. But my heart, I was genuinely I don't know what it was actually, but I was very anxious about it. And I wonder if you can think of examples like that for yourself of moments feeling anxious. But if we're honest with one another, there's lots to be anxious about in our world, isn't there? There are a lot of things to be anxious about. Economically, interest rates are rising. We feel the cost of inflation. There's various predictions of financial crises coming. There's a lot to be anxious about. Geographically, the climate is a fear for many, isn't it? There's such a thing now as climate anxiety rising in teens. There's much to be anxious about. Even just sociologically, the rise of social media use in teens has meant that the feeling of anxiety is growing and growing and growing. It's skyrocketing. There is much to be anxious about in our world, isn't there? Or maybe you weren't anxious when you walked in, but now you're starting to feel anxious. My apologies about that. That can be crippling, can't it? That feeling of anxiety, that can be crippling. It can pick away at our joy. It can impact all aspects of our life. It can be scary, actually, can't it? Well, this morning, we're going to look at the psalm that was so beautifully read for us. And I want to put to us, this psalm is a great comfort in our world, a great aid in our anxiety as we navigate the uncertainties of life. This psalm is a great help. It is balm for the soul. And it's a balm that comes from the very character of our God himself. What is God like? And how does what he's like, how does that interact with us in our world? How does that aid our anxieties? Well, it lies in two aspects of what our God is like. Two aspects of our God that come out of this psalm. And here's the first. It's God's full control. God's full control. This is the thing that stands out the most in our psalm. God's full control over everything that he's made. The psalmist uses two pictures to help us to get this. You've got the builder and the city watchman. Look at verse 1 with me. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. Do you see God's control on display here? The first is the builder. We'll call him Bob for obvious reasons. You've got a builder and a house gets built, right? Now, if you were just to look at that event happening, who would you say built the house? Well, it's the builder, right? That's kind of their job. But what does verse 1 say? Look at it. Unless the Lord builds the house. Implication? God has done this work. A person as well, yes. But behind it all, the Lord. The second picture is a watchman. There's a guard watching over the city, like in an old school watchtower. And naturally, again, you look at that and you go, man, that guy is watching the city. That's what's going on. But actually, who's doing it? Unless the Lord watches over the city. If God doesn't do it, it doesn't happen. Because he's in full control. There's a Latin phrase. Let me do my best to not butcher some Latin. Nisi Dominus Frustal. Now, it's a dead language, okay? So you can't say I got it wrong, really, can you? That's the motto of Edinburgh in Scotland. Anyone been to Scotland? Oh, looks beautiful there. I only really know it looks beautiful because Harry Potter was filmed there, but it looks beautiful. And that phrase is on the crest of Edinburgh, and it means, without the Lord, frustration. And that's this psalm, isn't it? Without the Lord's work, it's vain, frustration, because God is the one who ultimately makes things happen. To go about things without him is pointless, it's vain. Because our God isn't the kind of God who set up the world and then left it to do its own thing now. No, he is involved. He creates and he controls. He is sovereign over the things that he's made. We like to think that we don't need the sovereign God idea anymore because we've got science. We've worked out all the mechanics. And so there's nothing behind it. We've worked out how the things work. We've got settled science now. But just because God uses ends to achieve his means does not mean that he's not in control of it, does it? No. God is a God of order, not chaos. So it makes sense that he uses things that we would actually be able to see with our own eyes, test in ways that we can, to control his world. But don't let it fool you into thinking that God isn't in control. No. He's got it. Gravity works because God says work. Mathematics makes sense because God says this will make sense. And one domain where we see his full control, which is actually mentioned in this psalm, is in sleep. Did you notice that? Look at verse 2. In vain you rise early and you stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. It's actually two possible translations of this verse when you see it, and both could be right. The first is the one that we've got here. It's the idea that God gives sleep. God gives sleep to those he loves, and that is true. But there's another that I think makes a bit better sense of what's going on in this psalm, and it's that God gives to his beloved in his sleep. You see the difference? It's a subtle difference. That even in your sleep, God is going about his work. He is in full control. Even when you can do nothing, he is doing his things. And sleep is actually a great window into considering the full control of God, isn't it? Think about it. You spend a third of your life shut down, doing absolutely nothing. If you were to live 75 years, 25 years of your life asleep, you could watch the Lego movie 130,000 times. I would not recommend that. All right? And there's actually a great mystery to sleep. We're not 100% sure why we need it as much as we do, but we just do. But doesn't that just highlight how much in control God is? God is working 24/7, sustaining his world, giving life, giving breath, containing weather systems, tuning galaxies. And me? I'm snoring. I say I don't snore, but my wife says otherwise. I'm defenseless. I'm unproductive. I'm completely dependent on my God. We are all in complete debt and submission to this God who is in full control. And that's true of all of our life, isn't it? And that's one of the points of this psalm. We like to think that we've gotten to where we are because of our work, of the toil of our own back. Or if God was involved, it's kind of like a 90-10 split. 90% me, God did a couple of little things. But I've built my life. I've gotten to where I am because of my hard work. That's why I'm here. But are you really? Think about it. Think of how many factors interplay to have you where you are in your life now. It is crazy, isn't it? Your parents, did you choose them? For better or worse? Where you were born, did you decide that? When you were born, what managers or mentors were brought into your life? What teachers or tutors taught you the things that you know? When you think about it, there are so many things in your life that you have no control of that brought you to where you are, aren't there? Because God is in full control. And you've done things. These are things that just stand side by side. You work, yes, and God is in full control. The one who has given us our life, our breath, everything that we have. Unless the Lord builds the house. And this was written, look at a Psalm of Solomon. And this guy was known as the greatest of men at the time, the wisest man alive. And he says, this was all God, not me. It's a terrible tragedy when people say they've gotten to where they are without the God who has brought them where they are. He's been there the whole time. His full control. Which might help with our anxiety, or could actually make it a whole lot worse. Because this could actually be an unsettling truth, couldn't it? Think about it. History is riddled with people who ought not have power, but with it have caused chaos, ruin. Because absolute power corrupts? Absolutely. God has full control. Is that the case with him? Is it a scary thing for him to be in control? Because if so, that's no reason to rest at all. That's no help with our anxiety. That'll make it a whole lot worse. But here's where our second point shines through in the psalm. God has full control and fatherly care. Fatherly care. Let me ruin the KFC logo for you. See underneath his head, that's meant to be a little bow tie thing. But now whenever I see it, it just looks like a weird stick figure. Can you see that? A little stick figure, huge head, bobblehead thing. All right? Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every time you drive past a KFC, you will see this now. Well, that is what God's fatherly care is like in this passage. Once you see it, it is everywhere. It seems so obvious now. So have a look at it at the end of verse 2. He grants sleep. To who? Those he loves. Children are a heritage from the Lord, a reward from him. Come down. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. God's in full control, yes, but how does he use his full control? To show fatherly care to the people he's made. Over and over and over again. God is intimately involved in every instant of your life. And he chooses to use that to bless. Isn't that incredible? The great God of creation who made all things and sustains it all bends down, stoops down to your level and gives gifts to his creatures, to you, to me. And one of the fatherly blessings he gives in verse 3 is the gift of children. They're a great sign of God's sovereignty, aren't they? Life is made. And what did you do? Don't tell me, right? God made it happen. A simple act, and yet God makes life. New life that did not exist before. God creates. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but before we do, it's worth pausing and just recognizing that this may be hard for many people to hear, actually, because there'll be those amongst us for whom childlessness is a reality. And there are a whole host of reasons why that might be the case. And perhaps they're for reasons within your control, your choice, but often not. Isn't that right? There's unchosen singleness or desires that don't line up with God's idea of marriage. There's biology, infertility. There are lots of reasons why this might be the case. And man, they are painful realities and real. We've walked alongside people for whom that is the case, and it is really hard. And so before we talk about this, I just wanted to notice you and raise that before we speak about the blessing that is children. Because I think we can read the word reward in verse 3 in a way that's not meant. See, I don't think this is a reward in the sense of you did a good thing, here have a present for it. No, we know from the rest of Scripture that it doesn't work like that. Here it's that idea of a gift that we've spoken about. A gift that sometimes God in his full control and fatherly care gives. And other times, for reasons we don't know, he withholds. But they are a gift, aren't they, children? But in our world, are they seen as a blessing or more as a burden? See, fertility rates have been dropping for the past 70 years. They're down 50%. Now, there's lots of factors for why this is the case. There's lifestyle choices, delaying childbirth. There's money, the cost of having children and raising them. Again, the question around the climate has led people to think about the ethics of bringing more people into the world. And all of these factors play together to now, in the West, we're below replacement rate. That is, the amount of kids needed to just replace us is dropped below that. Friends, this ought to shock us. Are kids more of a burden than a blessing? And one of the things this psalm does is highlight, get on God's wavelength with children. They are a blessing, not a burden. There's a story about an old English bishop. I think it was in the 17th century. His name was Joseph Hall. And this is what he wrote. I remember a great man, a lord, coming into my house at Waltham and seeing all my children standing in the order of their age and their stature. And he had a bunch. And he said, these are they that make rich men poor. But he received this answer. No, my lord, these are they that make a poor man rich. For there is not one of these whom we would part with for all of your wealth. Isn't that great? A blessing, not a burden. And so enjoy the blessing of children. If you are married or looking to be married, have children. Get on God's wavelength here. They are a blessing. If you're a grandparent, you know the joy of grandkids, do you not? What a blessing. And perhaps even a greater blessing, you're able to give them back at the end of the day. If you're unable to have kids, there is a blessing to be had in church family together. We are a family. There are spiritual mums and dads, spiritual grandparents, great-grandparents, spiritual kids and grandkids. Use this as an expression of family together. A great example of God's fatherly care in the building of the home. What a kind God we have. You can trust this God. This God is not a concept or a bunch of ideas or just a book to assent to. No, this is a personal God with your best interests at heart, his fatherly care, which I think breeds a Godward attentiveness in our lives. I love that word, Godward attentiveness. It's living life in such a way where we don't just know that God is there or in the background, but where we're attentive to him, aware of him. We feel towards him. Our lives are shaped in such a way as to reflect his wants and desires. It's to see there's no such thing as the religious and the regular part of your life. They're all one. Because God is in everything we do. He's in the way that we serve in the home, in the way we serve in the church, the way you read with your kids, the way you eat with thankfulness in your hearts, the way you spend your money, the way you spend your time, the way you prioritize the things that you want and have, the way your life is shaped. Godward attentive, because he's in full control and has fatherly care. It's to trust him personally as your God. I remember a number of years ago hearing the story of an older saint in one of my old churches. And she'd lived through the Second World War. And man, she knew what it was like for things to be turned upside down. I thought I knew what being anxious was. Not even close to her. Talk about fear and pressure and pain and anxiety. And yet she said, I was never afraid because I know who my God is. Man, that is a powerful testament of a woman who gets that her God is in full control and yet has fatherly care for her. Now, what she knew in the scriptures, it didn't diminish her surroundings. It didn't make that easier or smaller. It just made her God bigger every time. And so she was a great encouragement to me and a great rebuke. So often I worry or first try and fix things myself and not rely on my God, who has got it in his hand and who loves me. And she was a great woman of prayer. She was a great woman of prayer. And how could you hear these things and get them and not be on your knees in prayer? You're telling me that this God controls all things and has my best interests at heart, and he listens to me when I pray for things. How could I not pray? What sign of dependence is greater than us being on our knees, asking our God to give us what we need, to help us in a world that is so full of anxiety? Dependence. And if we were living in dependence on this God, it would be strange for us to not want the things he would want, wouldn't it? Because depending on him means willingness to get the things that he will give. And so what does he care about? What does he ultimately care about above all things? Well, it's in this psalm, although sneakily. You'll notice at the top of your psalm, there's a title. It's the Song of Ascents. Now, a bunch of psalms are called this. They're all kind of grouped together from 120 to 134. They're all the Song of Ascents. And they're called this because people would sing it as they went up or ascended to the temple. And they'd sing these songs. It's a bit like you'd sing a song on the way to the school excursion on the bus. Wheels on the bus, yada yada. Or our one was, what was it? This is the song that never ends. And it did end, thankfully, but it took a long time. Well, this was their version of that. They had 15 songs and they would sing them on their way up to the house of the Lord. And even long after they were kicked out of the land and their house, the temple, was destroyed, they sang this song as a reminder that they had been building, but God had long left them. He had not been building, and so it was destroyed. A reminder of the vanity of going about as God's people without his provision. But I think one of the things that shows us is that God's work happens on God's watch. God is on about doing his work. And the same is true today, isn't it? God will save whom he will save. He will build his house. He has given his Son, the Lord Jesus, to die for us. And his Spirit calls people to have faith in Jesus, not us, his Spirit. We are completely dependent on God to build this house, to grow it, to raise it. And unless he builds it, we labor in vain. And this is good news, because if he doesn't build it, nothing happens. Doesn't matter how elegantly you speak or how well you've memorized your stories for the peace tent. If God is not behind it, nothing happens, but he is behind it. He does save. He longs for more people to trust in his Son. I think we all have a dominant foot in this. You know, when you get pushed, you land on your dominant foot. And I think everyone has one, and it's either do or depend. Mine is do. I'm at Bible college at the moment, and we recently went on a week of mission. One of the teams was at the Peace Tent in Lakemba. I was at a local church for the week. We went door knocking, we leafleted, we spoke to people about Jesus, we ran their kids club. We did a bunch of things. It was a great week. But a week prior, we had a whole day of college called Prayer Day. And I'm kind of new there, and so I remember asking someone, what is Prayer Day? And they looked at me like I was stupid. Like, it's a day where you pray. Come on. They set aside the whole day, and they cancel every class, and you pray. There was a long chapel service filled with prayer, and then you break up into your smaller teams, and you won't guess it, you pray. All right? And you know what? When I heard that we were doing that all day, I was kind of annoyed. You know, I'm going to give up my classes, a whole day of my time. I'm about to go on a whole week of mission, and I'm going to give up a whole day and just pray? Unless the Lord builds the house, we labour in vain. How foolish of me. How proud of me. Where was my dependence on my God in full control and fatherly care? And I wonder how often we do go about God's work without prayer to him. Dependence, our dominant foot. Now, we still do. We need to do. There are still builders that the Lord uses to build the house, but man, what would it be like if our life was shaped on dependence? If the first thing in the calendar was prayer, that would change me. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labour in vain. And so depend on your God. He's got it in his hand and he has your best interests in his heart. Depend on him. What a balm for the soul. What a help in an anxious world, yes? Let's pray. Oh God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you that you have full control over all things. We thank you that you haven't just set up creation and left it on its own, but you are intimately involved in every instant. And yet it is most comforting and glorious to know that in your full control, you have fatherly care for your creatures. Seen utmost in your love for your people, those saved by the Lord Jesus. We're sorry for the times where we haven't depended on you like we should, although we are completely dependent. We're so often tempted to do and do and do without depending. And so we ask that you'd forgive us in those moments, that you'd have patience with us in those moments, and you'd help it shape us and mould us into people of prayer and dependence on you. Amen.